All right. Well, I think we've got a decent amount of people that have joined up. So just wanted to make a quick introduction and just go give you a rundown of a couple things tonight. So first, my name is Jared Stephenson. I'm the curator of exhibitions here at the Utah Museum of Contemporary Art. And this is our second attempt at a virtual opening. We were able to do one last week and it seemed to run pretty well. So I think we're on track to have a good one tonight as well. First off, I'd just like to do a few thank yous to our sponsors and supporters. First, I'd like to thank Zoo Arts and Parks. I'd like to thank the George S. and Dolores Dore Eccles Foundation, the Diane and Sam Stewart Family Foundation, and I'd also like to thank the Lawrence T. and I'm looking on the floor, Janet T. Lawrence Foundation as well. I'd like to thank Devin for agreeing to do this, for taking the time out of her evening to speak to us about her work. I'd also like to thank Zach Norman, who is our marketing and communications director, who's figured all this out technology-wise for us so we can make these things happen. And then I'd like to thank all of you for joining with us tonight to be part of this conversation. So one thing as we go through the evening, Devin's going to take a little while to talk about her work specifically. I'm going to walk through the space and look for details or things that she's going to speak about. And then if you have questions that come up, what I'd like you to do is actually put them in the chat feature. And then that way we can send them directly to Devin and she can answer them without having to maybe wade through comments or anything like that. So if you have a question, add it to the chat feature. We'll capture it on our end and get them to Devin for a Q&A after the fact. So with that, I'm going to, say, all right, Devin, it's all yours. And good luck. Yeah.
All right. Hi, everybody, virtually. I can't see anybody, so I have no idea who I'm talking to. But my name is Devin Harclerode. I've been in Utah now for 2 years, since 2018, because I am the visiting assistant professor at Weber State University. And I just wanted to talk sort of a little bit about the conceptual origins of the work. I might get a little bit in the weeds, but then I'm going to talk maybe more specifically about the curtains themselves, and we'll try and look at them up close. But basically, I would say I'm an artist that's really research-based and project-based, meaning that I do research first and then sort of figure out the aesthetic later. So a lot of my projects are building off of each other, and I've been currently working on a lot of projects that are focused in the speculative. So thinking about the speculative and magical thinking as a point of departure, and ultimately generating sort of these speculative worlds that are made to then highlight and exaggerate how speculative thinking, especially in terms of domestic myths, are used to sort of turn into laws and then perpetuate oppressive phenomena. So when I talk about a domestic myth, what I really mean is sort of a social construction that then sort of guides the way that we make laws. So the domestic myth that I focused on primarily in this exhibition is the idea of sort of a private, singular family, a wholesome family, and something that maybe we would more colloquially in the United States think of as the nuclear family, right? So 2 parents, biological kids existing in one household, so not sort of an extended household-like situation. And I'm thinking about how this ideal or the ideology behind that wholesome nuclear family might extend to laws that limit sort of marginalized people's autonomy, people with a uterus, and people that identify as a women's autonomy. So in other words, issues of reproductive justice and anti-abortion laws. So the reason I'm thinking about that specifically in Utah was because when I moved here in 2018, I definitely noticed that the family structure is something that's really culturally relevant. The family is emphasized here in a way that I have been maybe less exposed to where I was coming from in Richmond, Virginia. But as somebody that was born in Florida, lived in the South, and was raised Catholic, the family structure was also something that was really important. So I felt some sort of identification with that, and I wanted to play around with it. And I also want to give a caveat that I love families, and, you know, I love my family. I love chosen families, which I think are even watching and listening to me now. And I also love the idea of children, and a lot of us are sort of nurturing or natural nurturers. But what I'm thinking about is how that ideal of that sort of nuclear family can be manipulated by people in power. And I'm specifically thinking about how that's manipulated within a capitalist framework for labor power. So what I mean by that is a lot of the research that I did for this show is coming from a book called Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend anything she writes. But in that book, she talks a lot about how midwives were persecuted as witches sort of at the advent of capitalism. And what that meant was, you know, midwives were people at that time that knew about contraceptives, family planning, about different ways of conducting abortion, and generally a woman having autonomy to her own body. So this works into the idea of capitalism or labor powers, because at that point, at the advent of capitalism, the singular private family was also being sort of held up as this ideal. And what it does is, by making the family more private or pulling it away from the collective or the commons that was sort of existing prior to capitalism, it made domestic labor become unwaged work. Domestic labor meaning, you know, a lot of you, like your mom who's cleaning and cooking for you, right? Or your dad who's doing that, or all of these things, all of this work that happens inside of the home that is necessary to produce a, you know, a worker who then goes and is productive in their job, right? You need that stress-free life, you need sleep, you need nourishment to be able to successfully complete a task in the public realm. So in saying that, you know, it kind of becomes like the really obvious, like, exploitive capitalist scheme, make domestic labor unpaid, and then it makes the actual labor of the person cheaper. So with that being said, right, then how does that connect to curtains, which is sort of the star of the show, Boundaries? And that has another connection to Utah, and I wanted the show to be specific to Utah because, you know, this is a space for Utah artists, and I think it's important to respond to the location that you're living in. So when I moved to Utah, I noticed in the neighborhood that I moved in Ogden, I live in Ogden, that the neighborhood was sort of populated by these mid-century ranch homes. My landlord's father built the home that we're living in, and they're kind of simple and minimalist, but a lot of them have these gigantic single pane windows, which are beautiful because you see like the scenery of the mountains, which I can see right now. Also lets a lot of light in because Utah is a very beautifully sunny place. But because these windows are so big, I noticed that a lot of people had curtains in their windows as opposed to blinds. And that maybe feels like a really strange distinction, but I guess where I was coming from in the East Coast, curtains just weren't as prevalent or popular. Mostly it was blinds. So I started to get really inspired and interested in sort of the curtain population that was occurring in my neighborhood. And I was especially interested in the curtain because there are more variables maybe or idiosyncrasies to the curtain, right? A lot of times you see the curtain like pushed or jammed in weird ways, or moved because the dog is, peeking out of the window. Curtains are dyed, right? They're not sort of the standard plastic of blinds, so they might be sun bleached. So there are all these like weirdnesses to the curtains that I was sort of identifying as the domestic object. So something that was really homey. We don't really think about curtains in terms of an institutional space because of like the practicality issues. But then also there are like these sort of gross idiosyncrasies to them again. So I knew I wanted to use those then as a metaphor. So in the show, in Boundaries, I wanted to use the curtains as this symbol of the domestic myth of sort of the private singular family. And I was thinking about that, or thinking about the curtain as sort of this liminal space, because the curtain often, still filters lights in, still lets some amount of light in, can be pushed back, is fluid. And in saying that, I was thinking about it as sort of a symbol for the example of the ideal family or the ideal domestic space. But then they also prevent public exposure, so that also becomes thus the symbol of the private, the non-collectiveness of the family that we more consider as the norm today. So when making the curtains in a museum space, they're out of context, right? We're looking at them, they're not covering a window, which we would normally think about. Again, we don't think about them in an institutional space. So I really wanted to use that strangeness, that fact that they're out of context, to sort of reflect on also the strangeness of social constructions and how that might manipulate the way that we determine what a home is, what a family is, what that domestic structure does. So for each curtain, there's 6 curtains, and they're each pairs, and they're representative of legislative, historical, and sort of social boundaries that I believe exist and then infect laws that can become oppressive and violent. So now I'm going to kind of talk specifically about the curtains. So maybe Jared, you can move in. We'll do the beaded curtains first. I don't know if you can, like, because they're kind of transparent, get a good look at them. So with the beaded curtains, when I think about a beaded curtain, I think that they're a little bit maybe more flippant than another curtain, because you don't normally think about them as functional. I think about them sort of associated with like a party aesthetic. I think a lot about my older sister had like these alien beaded curtains, probably from Spencer's Gifts, that I think about a lot, but they're just a little bit more fun. So in terms of the beaded curtains, I wanted to talk about sort of social boundaries, and the social boundary that I was thinking about specifically is binaries, and then more specifically gender roles. So this strictness of a binary can often be violent because it doesn't allow for this spectrum. So you see that in the beads themselves, because the beads, which I made molds for and casted out of resin, there's like a repeated pattern of about 50 different styles of beads, but they're all cut off. So they're all sort of these half beads. You don't feel them totally in the round. So that's sort of representative of this split, but then they each have their own identity. The beads themselves have all sorts of strange materials in them. They have a lot of dirt, herbs, hair, fingernails, and lots of different dyes and shells inside of them. But if you move up further to the other parts, so the first half of it is like the chain link part. Can you get to that? They're a little high. But of course, a chain link fence is something we clearly associate with some amount of a boundary, right? It's a perforated boundary. It stops you. And I was interested in these as split right? So again, this becomes a binary because all of these curtains are split, unlike the ones behind it, which are sort of a singular unit. And then the wobbliness, or like the subtle distortions of the fence, are referencing an amount of violence. And all of the curtains I want to sort of represent this vague notion of violence. And that's also replicated in the part right underneath the fence part, which are these strings of braids. And I use hair a lot in my work because off the body, it reads a lot as abject. Any part of our body that is cast off or severed feels uncomfortable because it feels othered. So thinking about that in sort of a more violent stage, and a lot of them are split between two pieces there. So I guess I'll move on now to the curtains behind. And then there's a split in all the curtains too. So these next curtains, which are these green organza curtains, I was thinking about them in terms of sort of historical boundaries that exist that sort of perpetuate misogyny. I was specifically thinking about how the historical trajectory of misogyny often leads us to sort of consider women in relationship to men. And the sort of specific part of it that I was referencing is quilting and sewing. So I made these using a quilting style for a single layer transparent quilt. And I was using sort of a log cabin pattern as the locus, which you can kind of tell there. So I was thinking about how women's crafts, or something like quilting or sewing, was often thought about as a woman's craft, and maybe that has something to do with how it's not often contextualized as high art when we're looking back in time, and how that's really important. The color, oh, am I muted? Or I'm good, okay. The color is something that's like a motif I bring up a lot in my work. I work with this sort of chartreusey yellow-green. I like this color a lot because it's green. So when I think about green, I often think about plants or nature, but if you change just these sort of tonal variations, so you're upping the saturation and you're adding a little bit more yellow in it, it feels a little bit more toxic. And it has this like sort of opposite effect. So I think the sort of high visibility of it, I'm really interested in. And then this idea of violence comes again through the eyelets in it. If you want to move over to the other one with the bigger grommets. So using, again, like something that you would normally use in making a curtain, but putting them out of place, they start to generate these holes. And with the addition of the hair, they relate to the body. So thinking about these as voids within the body. So again, hinting at this subtle violence. And in this curtain in particular, if you could walk back a little bit, there's actually an image of the Silphium plant in it. It's really subtle, and you would have to know what Silphium looks like to pick up on it. But Silphium is an ancient contraceptive that became extinct because it was overused. So it's something I think about a lot in my work in terms of speculative mythology to sort of resurrect it. So I wanted it to have presence in this piece. But now we can kind of move back to the last ones. So these last two curtains, I was thinking about, for them, legislative boundaries, and I was specifically thinking about the holes in them in terms less of sort of the violence of the ones in front of them, but more as like this idea of loopholes and different ways we use social constructions to generate loopholes, especially in what's happening with abortion laws recently throughout the country. But both of these curtains are different types of camo nets. And I dyed each of them first, and then I sort of took them apart and reassembled them. And I dyed them in non-sort of typical camouflage colors. I was thinking more about pastels with these, or again, high visibility greens, so that they sort of take away from how we normally consider camouflage. But when I made these nets, I was following instructions by different survivalist blogs that were like really sort of web 1.0 blogs on how to make these camouflage nets. And I'm excited by survivalism because it's something that I do think is more relevant here in Utah. Maybe that's because, you know, when people live in the mountains and there's snow, they can't get out. But, you know, I go to Macy's and I see like the survivalist section, and I think it's so interesting. And I'm interested in it mostly because of the subtext of it being about sort of do it yourself and being off the grid. But I think that subtext is often tinged with ideology. We think about it often as more of this right-wing ideology. And we think about it, I think, a lot in terms of rugged individualism as well. But, you know, this is something that I'm utilizing in my practice as well, like speculation and ideas of speculative exits from systems, which is sort of what I'm dealing with the resurrection of Silphium. So I like thinking about co-opting those DIY blogs and then using them in a different context. So obviously the camouflage here is not camouflaging anything. The colors don't help to camouflage surrounding the wall. And when you think about that too, you can think about the way that social constructions maybe act as camouflage for more insidious laws. So specifically thinking about using the family as a way to generate more labor power, and how that also bleeds into anti-abortion laws, and ultimately thinking about how that might contribute to sort of keeping poor people poor, or limiting somebody's autonomy to their own body in terms of family planning. So yeah, I think that's all I wanted to kind of intro in terms of the concepts around it, or how I got to all these different places. But I know it's kind of conceptually up there, so I'd love to clarify anything if y'all have questions, or also questions about process or materials and things like that. Oh, there is one other thing I wanted to say just about the installation, because I did want it to feel really experiential. The way that they occupy the space really limits your movement. And it's also about transparency, which you feel sort of through the shadows of the work as well. So the transparent factor of it, I'm thinking again of this idea of a liminal space. So thinking about social constructions as not real, right? They exist within phenomena, they exist abstractly, but it infects really real violence. So thinking about something you can see through, or can become immaterial, but is difficult to actually dismantle, which you feel through the way that you would have to walk through the exhibition. Yeah, does that make sense? I can't hear anybody, so. Are there any questions?
Yeah, sorry, it's Jared. I think it all makes sense. So I was just going to say the same thing. It's probably a good time to open up to questions. So if you have anything specifically for Devin, yeah, go ahead and throw it in the chat right now. And yeah, we'll see how that goes. Well, how about this?
Roseanne.
I want to throw something out that in terms of a material that you use, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the hair. And I know that the sort of, we talked a little bit about the issues around sourcing the hair and what that means for you as you're collecting it and where you're getting it from, and sort of the economics and the politics behind sourcing the hair. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I do use hair a lot in my work, I normally use sort of a store of my own hair, but I've run out of those stores, and I guess am unwilling to cut my hair for my practice at this point. But I think there are a lot of ethical issues with sourcing hair because it's often exploitive. As somebody that's working, you know, specifically within a political realm, I think it's extremely important to think about the sources of your materials. So the hair for this show came from, yes, Jessica, I am. But it came from a former student, and then it came from an eBay post of estate sale hair. So it had to have been a ponytail from the 60s. And I was talking to Jared about this, but there is something really interesting about working with it because, again, it's cast off the body, and I'm braiding them all after they're off the body. So there's a real intimacy I have. And it was with the hair I got off eBay, it had that very like old smell because it had been old. But then the hair that I got from a student had her smell on it, and there was something so interesting about sort of collaborating with her outside of being in class, but feeling her within the work. So I think it's really important to have that connection, and I sort of like that push and pull between somebody that's donating this to me that, you know, I have no idea who they are, and then somebody that I do know, and thinking about, you know, the collectivity kind of that happening together, if that makes sense. But
Yeah.
I use the hair sort of specifically because of the abject quality of feeling it off the body. So something that's so often thought of as a marker of beauty, when it's off the body becomes upsetting or feels like a severing of some kind, even though like cutting hair off isn't something that would hurt you. So I'm sort of interested in that push and pull.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks.
Yes, like Victorian morning hair. I'm reading a comment.
Yeah.
Yes, for sure. And I think that's so interesting because that becomes intimate too, especially that idea of sort of memento mori. Some other books I would recommend reading. Well, I made that Instagram post of the books that I have read. So definitely Caliban and the Witch. Sylvia Federici also wrote an essay called Wages for Housework, which kind of goes through that whole idea of unpaid domestic labor. There is a book I read, if you're sort of thinking about how the family structure could be manipulated, called Against Marriage by Claire Chambers, which just talks about the connection to marriage and legality and what it would mean to separate marriage from the legal system. And I think that has some really interesting arguments in it. I'm trying to think of some of the other books that I was referencing for it. The Art of Cruelty by Maggie Nelson, I think, is a really important book to read if you're working with some amount of violence or referencing violence in your work, especially in terms of expanding sort of definitions of violence and how violence is perpetuated in ways that maybe aren't physically seen. And then some of the other books I had where I found all these amazing, or I found one amazing like self-published book on textiles and fibers, and I sort of love collaborating with people like that are making self-published books about fibers, because I think that's really important too, because in a way it's a system exit, if that makes sense. Thank you, Kiki.
Yeah.
So I think that would become up to the viewer. Should I be reading the questions, or can I?
Maybe, or just sort of reiterating them. Maybe,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, I'll say this: I can't see them as well as probably people on computer screens. So maybe they're seeing them, and it's just me that's
Okay.
not. Yeah.
So Roseanne has asked me, are we meant to walk through the beaded curtains? And I would say that's sort of a choice I would want to leave up to the viewer. I think there's this split in it because it gives you the option of walking through. But I think it's really interesting to really consider how people try and interact with art, especially because we're sort of trained from a Kantian sort of perspective not to touch the art or to stay far away from it. So yeah, I would say I would be happy to see people walk through them. Something that I was thinking a lot about with this exhibition was because there are so many kids that go to this museum, and I was really excited to see how kids might interact with it, but of course that hasn't happened, but maybe it will. And I'll find out, because I think they would be enticing to children.
Yeah, and I'll jump in and say, as of right now, unless there are any major changes, the plan is to open up the sort of first week in July, and we'll have limited hours and probably only take 20 people at a time, roughly, just to keep things safe. But if you do and have the ability to come to the museum, yeah, please come down and experience the piece for yourself and be able to walk through it. It definitely, clearly, it changes something. It changes it if you're not having to look at it through a video screen. So.
Yeah. My grandfather has asked me a question, but it might be my grandmother masquerading as my grandfather. But they have asked how long it took me to do this. It took me a long time. But I dye all the textiles, or I feel like I have a real role in everything. So dyeing and painting, making all the individual beads was quite labor intensive, and then having to sand them and drill through them. And then the quilting technique itself is something, because you're doing sort of double seams. So I would say I started in August, and then it was mounted in last month. So that's about how long it took. Yes, I love that idea. Roseanne is saying, is there an aspect of tending? What do you mean by tending? Like in terms of upkeep? Garden, Silphium, tending to plants. Yeah, for sure. I mean, the herbs that are encased in the beads are all dried herbs. But, you know, this has sprung from like the offspring of my longer project of resurrecting Silphium. But of course, that has started to become more virtual. But I imagine that these will exist outside of a museum space, and I think could be, I like the idea of the access of using them as functional materials. So like, what if you actually had these curtains working in your house? So I love that idea. Any other questions? um, Totally. Yeah, if they become in the home, then they become these domestic accessories. Or maybe even thinking about like the bent and dog manipulated sun bleached curtains being intentional. Or what if we really used our window spaces as ways to interrupt how we design a domestic space? If that makes sense. Yes, Roseanne is saying, I imagine a person washing the hair gently at home. And yeah, totally. I think it could be performative. Or brushing the hair too would be kind of amazing. I did wash the hair, the hair I got on eBay at home. But then the hair from my student again had her smell to it. Like it had that like fresh or whatever her shampoo smell was, and it was kind of amazing. So I thank her very much for giving me her hair for this.
All right. Anything else from anybody? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I'm just going to reiterate what I'm sort of seeing on my screen. Like, thanks for taking the time, Devin, to really explain your process, explain the research, explain where the materials are coming from and how they're chosen. You know, I definitely encourage everyone to come down to the museum if they can to experience that. Because seeing the hair in person is clearly much different than seeing it on a screen. And sort of the way that you then relate to this work changes drastically. I'm mixing two words there. But yeah, thanks everybody as well for coming out virtually and spending the time with us this evening. We appreciate that time. So yeah, I don't know. Do you have anything else you want to say, Devin, or are you feeling pretty good?
I'm feeling good. Thank you so much for everybody that asked questions, which are a lot of people that I know and love. So I'm so thankful to them for coming, and anybody else, because I can't see who's here, but thank you.
Yeah. And then just one thing then, I guess, in the closing for us is clearly all small institutions, all institutions are going through tough times being closed to the public, and we are down our usual donations that we're able to accept during what would have been a time when we were open to the public. So if this is something that you've enjoyed and you'd be willing to do, you know, we typically ask for an $8 donation at the door, but anything that you're willing to do to help us out, we would greatly appreciate that at this time. So thought I'd throw that out there as well. So, and if you're interested in donating, I should tell you where to go. So I think there's a donate button on the website. So it's utahmoca.org, and you can go there and I think donate from there. So great. Okay. Thanks again. We appreciate everybody, and yep, have a good rest of your evening. Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. That was amazing.